Let's go in our Bibles to Exodus chapter 21. Exodus chapter 21. You might be thinking, man, Pastor Mark, I thought you were going to preach this section, and you can be seated. I'm going to take a little bit different approach today. But you might be thinking, Pastor Mark, you said that you could have preached all this in one, but decided to break it up into three, and we're still in Exodus chapter 21 instead of 23. Well, tonight we're going to cover chapter 21, verse 33 through chapter 23, verse 9. So we're going to cover quite a bit of ground tonight. But what you'll notice is that each of these sections that we've covered, they deal with particular matters related to respecting life in a broken world. That you'll remember that God has told Israel that they are not to operate like the nations around them, like the Egyptians, like the Canaanites, and that they are to respect human life. And so he gives these ordinances and these laws to set up their civil system in a way that reflects God's value of human life. And so as we've looked at this idea of respecting life in a broken world, we looked the first week out of verses 1 through 11 of chapter 21 at valuing human life, that God places a premium value on human life. And then last week, we looked at verse number 12 through verse 32, talking about protecting human life. Talked a little bit about capital punishment, protecting your family, protecting the unborn, and punishing the guilty. That's really the idea that he was getting across. And so we've talked about valuing human life, protecting human life. And tonight we're going to talk about this, preserving justice for human life. Preserving justice for human life. Now, our reading is going to be a little bit different tonight because we are covering such a broad section. So instead of reading all of the end of chapter 21, all of 22, and the beginning of chapter 23, I really just want to highlight some verses that will emphasize our main points tonight that God has for us. So we're going to begin our coverage tonight in verse 33 of chapter 21. But I actually just want to read chapter 22, beginning in verse 1 right now. We'll skip around and read a few different verses. So let's look at Exodus chapter 22 and verse number 1. If a man shall steal an ox or a sheep and kill it or sell it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If a thief be found breaking up and be smitten that he die, there shall no blood be shed for him. If the sun be risen upon him, there shall be blood shed for him, for he should make full restitution. If he have nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If the theft be certainly found in his hand alive, whether it be ox or ass or sheep, he shall restore double. So what we see here and what's going to surround this particular context is dealing with man's responsibility to make restitution when he has caused somebody to suffer loss. Whether it's by theft or it's by negligence, whatever it may be, that it's right that when you cause someone to suffer personal loss, you make full restitution. That's justice. It's fair. It's equal. Now I want you to look at verse number, what it's going to do is kind of deal with more issues of restitution here. And then look at verse 18, gives some other laws here. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Whosoever lieth with a beast shall surely be put to death. He that sacrificeth unto any god, save the Lord only, he shall be utterly destroyed. Then what it moves into is equality. That you are to treat all people fairly and justly. So look at verse 21. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him. Stranger would be a foreigner. For ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Verse 22. Ye shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. Look at verse 25. If thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as an usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. That's talking about if you lend to the poor, you're not to charge them interest, because otherwise they'll never be able to pay off that debt and they'll be your servant forever. And so what he's saying is don't abuse people in their condition of poverty. And so whether you're a foreigner or if you're a widow or a fatherless child or if you're poor, You're to treat them fairly and with equity. Now let's look at chapter 23, verse 1. Thou shalt not raise a false report. Put not thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. Neither shalt the countenance of a poor man, neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. Now what this is talking about is speaking truth in a court of justice. Don't follow popular opinion of the multitude. Don't decide that you're going to rule in favor of a man because he's poor or against a man because he's poor. And then look at verse 8. And thou shalt take no gift or bribe, for the gift blindeth the wise and perverteth the words of the righteous. Also thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for ye know the heart of a stranger, seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. And so what you have here is God instructing his people to preserve justice for all people. Whether it's if you're responsible to make restitution, or if we're talking about fatherless, widow, poor, foreigner, or if you're talking about telling the truth and making sure that a true verdict comes out. What you see in all of this is God holding them responsible to ensure justice is truly meted out. And when we talk about justice, we're talking about what is fair, what is equal, what is equitable. And so that's the idea that we're talking about tonight, preserving justice for human life. Throughout our nation's history, we've experienced different types of social reform, or what many might call social justice. You know, it's that desire for fair and equal rights for all people. And so you could go back in our nation's history where you had the women's suffrage movement, which was giving women the right to vote in society. In the 1950s and 60s, you had the civil rights movement, that while slavery had already been abolished at the end of the Civil War, or following the Civil War, we continue to have segregation in schools, in churches, in society. African Americans were not allowed to vote at that time. And so there was the civil rights movement to ensure that blacks, African Americans were able to have fair and equal treatment. And that went a long way, spearheaded by people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks to really bring more equality and to minimize racism, segregation, and prejudice in our society. Then you had the women's choice movement that sought to legalize abortion and give them what they considered the right to choose. Then you had the gay rights movement in the 60s and 70s, or 70s and 80s, states began repealing their anti-sodomy laws. Believe it or not, there was actually like legalities against homosexual behavior and those kind of things. And so they began to repeal those in the 70s and 80s. And in 2015, of course, we know that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of gay marriage across the board in the United States. And the reality is this. Whether or not you agree with everything that has come under the name or the umbrella of civil rights, human rights, equal rights, all of those things, we could all acknowledge that here in America, that there has been a long history of fighting for what we call social justice. Or the fair and equal treatment of human life. That's really what it's about. And of course, there can be ulterior motives going through that, but that's the basic premise of what social justice is ensuring that everyone that everyone gets a fair chance, has fair and equal rights. Here's the problem: that American society has often pursued equal rights through broken memes. Through broken memes. Yes, memes. You're totally right. Memes is what I meant, not memes. Maybe broken memes is a thing today, but anyhow, I mean, just think about it. Let me make that statement again, because it's important for us to understand this. Pursuing social justice is not wrong, but you can pursue social justice by wrong means. In America, our history and our pursuit of social justice has been violence, anarchy, revolution, reverse discrimination, reverse oppression. And thus, for the sake of human rights, what ends up happening is you have very highly qualified individuals who are passed over for a job or passed over for a promotion specifically for the sake of diversity and inclusion, to ensure that people who fall under certain minority categories, that corporation, I know this because I've lived in the corporate world for 10 years, that corporations are trying to get their companies to where it's equal all across the board, where they have as many men as they have women, as many whites as they have all the different races, that they're trying to bring equality to their corporation. But what you actually do there is you reverse discriminate. That somebody may be passed over who is extremely far more qualified because he's a 60-year-old white man with some gray hair. I'm not being unkind. That's reality. And if you ask anyone who falls under that category, they've lived it and experienced it, and it hurts. And so what we're talking about is while you're trying to pursue equality, you can end up actually hurting equality by reverse discriminating and reverse oppressing against other people. You think of businesses are broken through, looted, and burned to the ground in the name of social justice. Police officers gunned down in cold blood while simply filling up their trooper vehicle with gas. We've seen that. Christians are often branded as haters, bigots, homophobes, and some are even attacked. Their facilities are. Faith-based pregnancy centers have been tagged and set on fire shortly after the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But we can also agree that people on the other side of the social justice movement have faced their fair share of discrimination, of oppression as well. Planned Parenthood has faced its share of attacks and protests. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Gays and trans have been bullied and abused. I mean, these are just realities. And so the fact is that social justice is such a strong pursuit, or the fact that social justice is such a strong pursuit in our society reveals that on many levels, human life is not respected, valued, or protected. And in the process of pursuing social justice, we often find ourselves being guilty of committing other injustices in the process. Why? Because people are trying to bring about social justice in a way that reflects culture and society rather than in a way that affects true godly morality. And so in the name of social justice, society can find itself simply doing the same things to other people. But let me say this that might feel a little bit jarring initially, that God is 100% in favor of social justice. 100%. That all people would have equal rights. That all people would be equally valued. That all people would be equally protected. That all people would be treated justly and fairly. Sometimes we can confuse those things. And we can do something unjustly in the name of doing it fairly. The reverse discrimination is one of those things that we would talk about. And so sometimes we can be guilty of that. But we need to understand what kind of justice is God in favor of. One is that nobody would be mistreated based on who he has made them to be. That's one of them. His goal is that nobody, rich or poor, religious, non-religious, whatever you're talking about across the spectrum, his desire is that every single human life would be treated fairly and equitably. And so God, however, does not call his people to pursue social justice the way that fallen society does. that he does not call us, his people is what we're talking about. He does not call us to violence. He does not call us to anarchy. He does not call us to revolution or to reverse discrimination or oppression. God's solution is not for Christians to overthrow the civil system. He said, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for the powers that be are ordained of God, that God has put them in place for a specific reason. Rather, what we find in this text is that God's solution is for his people to police themselves with a moral understanding that every life, regardless of who they are or where they came from, is made in the image of God and therefore is to be treated justly, fairly, and equally. He calls us to police our own hearts by his Spirit and through his word to pursue justice for all, not according to society, but according to what God says. In these ordinances here, God has instructed Israel to show respect for human life by valuing human life and by protecting human life. And in this final section of ordinances here, he calls them and he calls us as his New Testament people to show respect for human life by preserving justice for human life. The question tonight is this: well, how do we do that? And that's the instruction that God gives us here in his message tonight. How do we pursue justice God's way? Not America's way, not Egypt's way, not Canaan's way, but God's way. The first thing we're going to see is this: that we preserve justice for human life by making restitution for personal loss. What happens here is that restitution was to be made when a man suffered loss due to somebody else's negligence. If we look back at chapter 21 and you look at verse number 33, it says this: and if a man shall open a pit, or if a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, and an ox or an ass fall therein, the owner of the pit shall make it good and give money unto the owner of them, and the dead beast shall be his. So in other words, if this guy digs a pit and he doesn't cover it up with boards and stuff, and a random ox comes by or another beast falls into that pit and dies, the person who dug the pit is responsible to pay the owner of the ox the amount that the ox is worth. And then he's to take the dead ox for himself. And so he's purchasing it. That sounds fair. That sounds just. It sounds equitable. And that's the whole point here. Verse 35. And if one man's ox hurt another's that he die, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money of it, and the dead ox they shall they divide. Or if it be known that the ox hath used to push in time past, and his owner hath not kept him in, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead shall be his own. The point of this is really this: that destruction of property due to negligence requires restitution to restore the value of that ox. It's fair, it's just, it's right for you to repay the loss that is due to your negligence. And so as this applies to us, sometimes you can unintentionally cause someone else to suffer personal loss due to your own personal negligence. And what preserving justice means in that situation is making restitution, making it right. For example, that means if you're driving too fast on icy conditions and you're being a little bit of a rogue and you come up to a stoplight and all of a sudden you can't stop and you plow into the back of another person, what God is saying is the right thing to do is not for you to flee the scene of the accident. The right thing for you to do is not to tell the cop that it wasn't your fault, or to tell the cop that it was their fault, or to make up some story. It's not for you to try to pin the insurance on them to cover your car when it was your negligence. The right thing to do is for you to call the police, give the report, have it reported to your insurance company, and for your insurance company to pay that claim, even if it means your insurance is going up. We're talking about making it right. Why? Because that person suffered a total loss due to your going too fast. and not able to stop. That's what it would be talking about here. Or how about this? If your dog has a reputation of being vicious toward others and you don't keep him on a leash, and that dog goes and attacks somebody, you bear responsibility in that. And so their medical care and those kind of things, whether you have liability insurance or you're calling the police to make sure, instead of just running away with your dog because you're scared they're going to put your dog down for the attack, that you care about that human life. Because I realize where I'm at in animal-loving Boulder right now, but the reality is God values human life over animal life. He did not make animals in the image of God. He made man in the image of God. And that's why when it comes to these instructions, he's saying that hey, the animal's to be put to death if it takes a human life. Because God values the human life in that way. And so when it comes to the situation that you're going through, according to what God says here, if that dog attacks somebody, you're to kill the dog, divide the meat, and eat it. No, I'm just kidding. That's what he was talking about with oxen. That's not what we're talking about today. But the point is just mainly this, that you have some responsibility for that person's medical care and to follow our law as it is set up, to do whatever is required of you to make it right. That's what he says here, is that the owner is to make it good. That he's to do what's morally right, to make restitution here. And so it's not about us getting off easy. It's about justice being preserved for that particular individual for the loss of his property. And so then what happens is, as we move into chapter 22, he talks about how restitution is to be made in the cases particularly of theft. And so as we read here, if you look at verse 1, it says, if a man steal an ox or sheep and kill it or sell it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. And so that means that it's not just like accidental loss out in the field because a animal fell into a pit. Now he's saying if you go into somebody's land and you steal 1 ox, you owe them 5 oxen. If you steal 1 sheep, you owe them 4 sheep. And so now it's not just making it right, it's actually compensating even further. And then it says this in verse 2. If a thief be found breaking up, it's talking about a burglar here, and be smitten that he die, there shall no blood be shed for him. Okay? What this is talking about, because we're going to see this here in the next verse, it says, if the sun be risen upon him. And so the first verse, verse 2, is talking about if let's just put it this way. Let me just give you an illustration. Let's say somebody's breaking into your house at night. You can't see anything. Imagine you're in their world. We don't have light switches you can just turn on. You start hearing somebody moving around inside the house. You've got little kids in there. You've got your wife in there. And you go to defend yourself and you can't see what this guy has or anything. And you take a big old candlestick that's made out of gold and you knock him out. And he never wakes up. It says no blood's to be shed for him. That you have the right to defend yourself in that way if somebody enters your home. But now look at verse number 3. It says this. If the sun be risen upon him, so now there is light. It is daytime. There shall be blood shed for him. So now if it's daytime and you take that golden candlestick and you can identify the perpetrator and you knock him out or strike him or shoot him or whatever and he's dead, you kill this man, then your life is to be taken. Why is that? God treats burglary different than he treats murder. He ordered capital punishment for the murderer because that's the taking of human life. But he says that human life is more important than stuff. And so if they come in and they steal your stuff, you're not to kill that person because it's just stuff. But that doesn't mean that it's without justice, because then it says in the end of verse 3, for he shall make full restitution. If he have nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. And so now you've got this guy who's been caught, and he's not to be put to death because he is to restore everything that he stole from this man. And so he is to live. So you see here the difference in punishments that God gives, that if somebody kills somebody, they're to be put to death. But if stuff is taken, the stuff is to be restored. And then it says in verse number 4, if the theft be certainly found in his hand alive, whether it be ox or ass or sheep, he shall restore double. So whatever he stole, he's not just supposed to restore what he took, he's supposed to restore double of what he took. And so then what happens is in verse number 5, it says, if a man shall cause a field or a vineyard to be eaten, and shall put in his beast, and shall feed in another man's field, of the best of his own field, and of the best of his own vineyard, shall he make restitution? And so now you've got a guy saying, you know what, my crops are a little bit low this year. I'm going to take my cows and I'm going to take my sheep and I'm going to put them in my neighbor's field and they can eat off of theirs. He's saying, that's stealing. You're not supposed to do that. And whatever your animals have eaten, you're to restore not just of your field and of your vineyard, but of the best of it. And so you see this idea once again of making full restitution. And so while God's command is this, we know this from Exodus 20, thou shalt not steal. That sounds very simplistic, doesn't it? But while that's God's command, God also knows this, it's going to happen. And you're to deal with this in a manner that is just, fair, and equal. And what God considers to be just is if you steal, you're to pay back more. If your animal eats, you're to pay back better. And so you can see what God is getting across here is a system of justice. That because we are fallen, sometimes we're going to end up stealing, but God's plan is for us to make restitution. I can remember when I was 7 or 8 years old, I was at a friend's house. I was a wicked preacher's kid at this age. I was at a friend's house, and she had a 2 or 3 year old little brother that had a piggy bank. And he took all this money out of his piggy bank and was showing me his money and was so proud of it. And then he puts all the money back in and shows me how that works and all that. And then the wicked fallen child that I was, when everybody left the room, I popped that little cork out and I took all the silver coins for myself and I left all the pennies there. You know, I thought I was real slick, thought I was real smooth. And so that's what I did, and I kept that money for myself. It was like $8. I went to Walmart, and I bought a Jacksonville Jaguars little football because I liked the logo, and the football looked cool. And so I bought this, and then over the course of time, the next few days, it was found out that I had stolen the money and that I bought this football with it. And my dad took me to this passage, and he said, if you steal something and you sell it or you use it, you're to pay back fivefold. What's fivefold of $8? $40. How old was I? 7 or 8 years old. You think I had $40? No way, no how. So what did my dad do? He sold me into slavery to my mother. And I had to do chores, and I had to work for 40 hours, for 8 hours, and $5 an hour to be able to make this $40 back. And I was scrubbing baseboards with a toothbrush, and I was cleaning windows and vacuuming and doing all these chores around the house to be able to pay this young man back. But I'm thankful all these years later that I had a dad who taught me that when you steal something from someone, you have a personal responsibility to make it right, to make it good. And a dad who followed biblical principles to ensure that even young 2 or 3 year old boy received justice. Thankful I had a dad like that. Well, you may not steal from a kid's piggy bank. I hope you don't. But the reality is there are other ways that you can steal. You could steal pens and paper clips from work. You could steal time from work. You could rob your spouse of your relationship. You could steal things from other people. And what God is telling us is that He so values human life that whenever you steal something, you're to make it right. You're to replace what you've taken. You're to apologize. You're to repent. You're to make it right when you have taken something. Why? Because it's just. It's fair, it's equal, and it's the right thing to do. And so that's what he's telling them here. That's what it means for us today. But then the next part that he's going to get into, beginning in verse 6, is that restitution was to be made for accidents of negligence. Okay? This one we're probably familiar with in verse 6. And if a fire break out and catch in thorns, so that the stacks of corn or the standing corn of the field be consumed therewith, he that kindleth the fire shall surely make restitution. You know what this means? If you're up camping, I hope this isn't you, I'm talking generically here, but if you're up camping and somebody's smoking and they flick a cigarette out into the wildfire or out into the wild grass, and that grass catches on fire and the wind blows it up and it becomes a huge wildfire, that you're to accept some kind of responsibility for that. That's what it's saying here, that if you kindle a fire and it gets out of control and it burns down somebody's stacks of corn or their field of corn, that you're to replace that. You're to make it right. You're to assume responsibility. Verse 7, if a man shall deliver unto his neighbor money or stuff to keep, so he's now putting you in a stewardship. He's giving you, maybe it's animals or maybe some nice material goods or something like that. It says, and it be stolen out of the man's house. If the thief be found, let him pay double. So if you find the thief, he's to pay double, just like the law that was previously given. But then in verse 8 it says, if the thief be not found, then the master of the house shall be brought unto the judges to see whether he have put his hands unto his neighbor's goods. So if you don't find the thief with the stuff, then you're to go before a judge, the one who is responsible over them, and the judge is going to scrutinize them and make sure they are not the ones who have stolen from it. And so then for verse 9, it says, for all manner of trespass, whether it be for ox, for ass, for sheep, for raiment, or for any manner of lost thing which another challengeth to be his, the cause of both parties shall come before the judges, and whom the judges shall condemn, he shall pay double unto his neighbor. So now if you've got the neighbor, if he's found out to be guilty of stealing, he's to pay double to his neighbor who put it in his hands. But if the neighbor is accusing him and he's found out to have not stolen it, then the accusing neighbor is to pay double to the neighbor he accused. And so what he's saying is this: don't falsely accuse people of stealing things if you don't know they actually did it. It was to be a deterrent from false accusation. Now let's look at verse number 10. If a man deliver unto his neighbor an ass or an ox or a sheep or any beast to keep, and it die or be hurt or driven away, no man seeing it, then shall an oath of the Lord be between them both, that he hath not put his hand unto his neighbor's goods, and the owner of it shall accept it thereof, and he shall not make it good. And so what that means is if there's no eyewitnesses and nothing can be proven, they're to come before the judges, and an oath is to be made, because if that person binds himself to an oath by the name of the Lord, God is going to hold them responsible. But then also the owner is to accept it. That's basically saying this: if there's no witnesses, I'm just going to leave this in God's hands. That's essentially what that is saying. And then verse 12 it says, and if it be stolen from him, he shall make restitution unto the owner thereof. If it be torn in pieces, then let him bring it for a witness, and he shall not make good that which was torn. So if the beast is out in the field and the wolves or the coyotes get to it, and it's, you can kind of tell when something has just been eaten by wild beasts. And so they bring it as a witness, and if it's proven to be eaten by wild beasts, then the guy who is watching it doesn't have to make restitution for it. And so you can see there's a balance here where he's saying that if you are guilty, it's right, it's fair, it's equitable, it's just for you to make it right, for you to make restitution. But if you're not, then it's fair and just to let that person go and not to falsely accuse them. And so that's the idea of what he's getting at. Now let's look at verse 14. And if a man borrow aught of his neighbor, and it be hurt or die, the owner thereof being not with it, he shall surely make it good. So now, let's just put it this way. You borrow your friend's snowblower, okay? Because we don't use like animals for our equipment and stuff. That's really what it would have been for plows and those kind of things. So let's say you're borrowing a friend's snowblower, and you get it caught up in the rocks, and the rocks jam it, and the rocks break it. You're supposed to pay him for that. But if you say, hey, buddy, will you come and use the snowblower in my driveway? And the owner of the snowblower is using it, and he gets the rocks caught up in it, and it breaks it and jams it. then the owner of the house doesn't have to pay the owner of the snowblower for something he did on his own. Okay, look at verse 15. But if the owner thereof be with it, he shall not make it good. If it be an hired thing, it came for his hire. So if you've hired your buddy, he comes over, he's working with it, and he's responsible for the death of this animal or the breaking of the snowblower, that's on him. That's not on you. And so God's interested in here in making sure it's just for all parties involved. Now look at verse 16, and it gets into an immoral relationship. If a man entice a maid or seduce a young virgin that is not betrothed, and lie with her, he shall surely endow her to be his wife. He's to give the dowry to her father, and he's to take her to be his wife. That no man is to use and abuse a young woman. That's what he's talking about here. You don't take what you can from her and then cast her off. No, once you have taken her virginity, you are to take her to your wife, and you are to care for her, and she is to be entrusted into your care. But, verse number 17, if her father utterly refuse to give her unto him, he shall still pay the money according to the dowry of virgins. So the man still bears responsibility in this situation, even if the father says, no, you can't marry my daughter, you dirty, rotten, nasty boy. That's really the perspective that you get here. And so when you consider, and that's because it's not like the daughter is viewed as property of the father. It's a respectful relationship. That when you come, and let me just say this, they ought to ask the woman's dad before he asks for her hand in marriage. We've kind of gotten away from that. But that's a respectful family thing, and that's what this is talking about. You would give a dowry, and they still do this in Eastern cultures. You give a dowry in exchange for the woman's hand in marriage. And sometimes it's arranged, and sometimes it's of the free will, And what it's talking about here is there's an enticement, there's a seduction that this man has won this girl's heart to him, and then he engages in this relationship with her, that now that he's done that, he's not to just use her, abuse her, and let her go. He's to take her to be responsible over her now as his wife. And so as you look at this, what it's talking about is theft. What that would be considered is stealing a man's daughter. That's how that would be viewed in their system. And so when you look at all these different things that we examined here in this part of the chapter, it's that when you cause personal loss, you preserve justice for the other person by making full restitution for the suffered loss. And so if you start a fire and the fire gets out of control, that's your responsibility. And instead of trying to sneak your way out of the situation, your responsibility to do whatever's required by the law in that matter. Whether that's showing up in court, or if it's paying a fine, or if it's jail time, or making restitution for the lost property, that's your responsibility. If someone lets you borrow their car and you wreck it, you should report that to your insurance and not theirs, because that was your fault. Their premium shouldn't go up because of your negligence in using their car. If someone lets you borrow their tools and you lose them or break them, it's right for you to replace them. Preserving justice means doing whatever is fair and equal for the person who suffered loss. And that's what God was calling Israel to do here. And that's the same thing he expects us to do as his people, to preserve justice God's way, to make it right, to make it good. And so the first way that we preserve justice is by making restitution for personal loss. And then what's going to happen in verses 18 through 20 is God tells them that witchcraft, bestiality, and idolatry are all punishable by death. And then he moves on to the second way that we can find how we can preserve justice, and that is by ensuring fair treatment for all. Ensuring everybody is fairly treated. Look at verse 21. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. So we're talking about a foreigner who comes into your people. You're not to oppress them just because they're not like you. You're not to oppress them because they speak a different language. You're not to oppress them because they have a different color skin, different color eyes, different style hair. You're not to oppress them based on where they came from. Verse 22, ye shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. Those would have been the most defenseless people in society because there's no longer a man to take care of them. And so he's telling them, you're not to go and use and abuse these people and take advantage of them because they're defenseless, whether it's a widow or a fatherless child. It's wrong for you to do that. And then look at what God says in verse 23. If thou afflict them in any wise, and they cry at all unto me, I will surely hear their cry. That sounds like a threat. That's exactly what it is. Verse 24, and my wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. So if you come to a place where you're going to oppress a widow and a fatherless child, God says, then I'm going to take your life so that your wife and your children know what it's like to be a widow and fatherless. That seems a little bit harsh, but here's what God's communicating. Life for life. If you're not going to value and you're not going to protect and you're not going to preserve justice for the fatherless and the widow, then I'm going to give you a just treatment here. That's what God's talking about, something that's equal, equitable. Now look at verse 25. If thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. And so now he's saying don't charge interest to the poor. So you see the pattern here. Don't oppress the foreigner because they're foreign. Don't oppress the fatherless and the widow. Don't oppress the poor. You need to treat them fairly, not just equally, but fairly. If you charge them interest, which is what's called usury here, they will never be able to buy themselves out of this debt that they owe you, and thus they're going to be your slave for their entire lives. And God says that's not fair, and you're not to treat them that way. So don't charge interest to the poor. Now look at verse 26. If thou would all take thy neighbor's raiment to pledge, this is talking about taking a coat, an overcoat, as collateral for an exchange or a business transaction. He says, if thou take thy neighbor's raiment to pledge, thou shalt deliver it again unto him by the sun, by that the sun goeth down. For that is his covering only. It is his raiment for his skin. Wherein shall he sleep? And it shall come to pass that when he crieth unto me, that I will hear, for I am gracious. So if you take the cloak or the outer coat of somebody, which would be for their warmth, if you take that from them as collateral, you're to give it to them at the end of each night so that it can cover them from the cold so they can be warm. Treat them right. Don't abuse them. Treat them fairly. That's his point there. And so he says, and if you don't, then I will deal with it. And so what God is communicating here is this. You're not to treat people with prejudice based on their nationality, their social standing, or because they owe you something. And so consider, we're not to mistreat foreigners. That's what this means. I realize we have a serious border crisis here right now, and because of our American patriotism, that can be certainly frustrating, very upsetting at times. Frankly, it can be scary at times to just wonder who's crossing that border right now. But while we are Americans, we also need to remember that first and foremost, our citizenship is to another kingdom, a heavenly kingdom, one that is to operate differently. And it might be that if you find yourself on the right side of the aisle in the color red and you're conservative, you're going to be grouped in with a bunch of people who say some pretty nasty and rotten things about immigrants coming to America right now. Some who mistreat them. Some who are prejudiced toward them, some who are hateful toward them. But what God is talking about here is that's not who my people are supposed to be. That no matter what, and let me just say, I'm frankly upset with our justice system that we're not holding our laws that are in place. Yes, I'm upset with that. But the fact that our justice system is failing doesn't give us the right as Christians to mistreat those who are coming in. It just flat out doesn't. The way we look at them, the way that we talk to them, the way that we treat them ought to be with value. It ought to be with protection, and it ought to be with justice. To treat them kindly. I'm all for the legal system, but we don't have permission from God to treat people differently based on the color of their skin, the language that they speak, or the culture that they come from. They are still human beings made in the image of God, and we have a responsibility to treat them as such. That we should love them. We should care for them. And most importantly, we should share the gospel with them. That we can't all go to all the different countries of the world, and yet God has in some ways opened up a door of opportunity to bring the countries of the world to us. And it just may be that if we will love them and care for them and share the gospel with them, that they get saved, and then they can go back to their home country and they can win dozens of people to Christ there. But that's our responsibility. He says very plainly and clearly that you're not to oppress a foreigner because you were strangers in Egypt. Can I remind you, we are a country of migrants. We all came from somewhere. Unless you're Native American, but even if you're a Native American, you moved here from somewhere out in the Middle East. We all find our origins there. And so the reality is as patriotic as we may be, we've got to remember our citizenship, first and foremost, belongs to heaven, belongs to a king who is God, who has commanded us and showed us that every person is made in the image of God, and therefore we should treat them with fairness, equity, and justice. According to the book of James, when people walk into church, we are to have no respect of persons. That we don't treat those who pull up in a Tesla different than we treat those who pull up in a beater. That you don't treat the rich better than the poor because they have something better to offer, so to speak. That we're not to, the way that James describes it is you don't just treat people better because they're dressed better. You don't give them the better seats at church because they're dressed in rich and wealthy clothing, and then you tell the poor people, we got a spot in the back for you. He says, no, that's not what you do. I see them both as equally valuable. And so as a church, we've got to make sure that we are treating people as they come into our church family with fairness, equality, and justice. And so we're called by God to preserve justice, not only by making restitution, but also by ensuring fair treatment of others. Now, in the next few verses, God gives instruction regarding their civic and religious responsibilities, that they're not to revile the gods. That would be a way of talking about that, a common way of talking about their judges. They would use that word Elohim, which is the plural for gods, and so that's why it's translated the way it is here. But that would be referring to the judges of the people. Don't slander your judges, okay? And then he also says in verse number 28, don't curse the ruler of thy people, your king, your president. And so you're not to do that. He talks about how they're not to delay their offerings, that they're to bring the first fruits to God, that they're to offer those on the specific required day. That verse 31, they're to be holy men. They're not to eat any flesh that is torn of beasts in the field, that they're to give that to the dogs. And so he's telling them just yet again, you've also got a responsibility to God. Let's make sure that you maintain that responsibility to God as well. But then chapter 23 opens up here with the third way that we're to preserve justice, and that is by telling the truth. Do you see how these are kind of falling in line with the Ten Commandments? Thou shalt not kill. He deals with corporal punishment. Thou shalt not steal. He certainly dealt with that. Remember the Sabbath. He's going to deal with that as we'll look at next week. He's talking about bearing false witness is what he's talking about here. God instructs them to give a faithful and true witness in legal cases. Look at verse 1 of chapter 23. Thou shalt not raise a false report. Put not thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. You know what that's talking about? A handshake. Don't make deals with the wicked or the guilty. Give a true report. He says in verse 22, thou shalt not follow the multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many, to wrest judgment. You see that multitude, many? What he's saying is don't make your decision, don't give your testimony based off what the populace wants. Don't follow the multitude. You need to concern yourself with truth, Don't try to delay it. That's what the word rest judgment means. It means to stretch this thing out. So don't give a false testimony and don't give a vague testimony. If you know what is true, you need to say the truth. Verse 3, neither shalt thou countenance a poor man for his cause. Countenance, that means to look favorably upon someone. So don't just look at this trial and give a false report or a false witness simply because you feel bad because the man is poor. But then if you look at verse 6, he says, thou shalt not rest the judgment of thy poor in his cause. That would be like the opposite. Don't prolong it because a guy is poor. And so what he's saying here is your testimony should be more about the truth than it is about who's involved in it. That's what he's getting at here. If you look at check this out. If you look at verse 4, if thou meet thine enemy's ox or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it back to him again. If thou see the ass of him that hateth thee lying under his burden and wouldest forbear to help him, thou shalt surely help with him. What's that talking about? So there's this guy you hate, and he's got an animal out there that's fallen in a pit. Don't you walk by that and say, well, since I hate that guy, I'm just going to let this animal die. Animals would be very valuable to them, of tremendous worth. And so he says you're not to do that. And then if you come by your enemy's donkey and it's fallen under his burden, it's too heavy for him, he says you're not to just pass by him because he's your enemy. He's saying you need to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. It doesn't matter who's involved. You need to go to that man and tell him, hey, your ox has fallen under his burden. You need to go help. Even if he's your enemy, even if he's somebody that hates you, you're responsible to do the right thing and tell the truth, even if it's your enemy. Verse number 7, keep thee far from a false matter, and the innocent and righteous slay thou not, for I will not justify the wicked. What he's saying there is you better not give a testimony that's going to let the wicked go free or let the just be destroyed, the righteous, the innocent. And so what he's saying is you need to be concerned with what the truth is. That's how you preserve justice. Don't lie about an innocent person so they end up in jail. And don't lie about a guilty person so that they won't end up in jail. You need to tell the truth. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Look at verse 8. And thou shalt take no gift, for the gift blindeth the wise and perverteth the words of the righteous. Also, thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for ye know the heart of a stranger, seeing you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Because this is in the context of justice, what he's getting at is just like he said with the poor and just like he said with the multitude, that you're not to give a false report just because somebody is a foreigner. You are to concern yourself with the truth. And so you're not to, as we consider how this relates to us today, you're not to treat people with prejudice. You are not to you're not to pervert judgment by telling false testimonies, but rather you're to preserve justice for human life by telling the truth, no matter what or who it involves. And so if you're given the responsibility to testify in a legal case, you're to tell the truth. Whether it's a pastor, a politician, a friend, a homeless person, an enemy, what you saw is what you're to testify of, regardless of who or what it involves. It would also mean this: if you serve on a jury, you have to sign a document that says you're not going to go on Google and find out what's going on in this case. You have to do that. And you're responsible to stand to that. You're not to look up the story. You're not to be persuaded by public opinion of who the plaintiff is or the defendant is. You're to be responsible to take in all the evidence and all the facts in order to give a just verdict. That's how you preserve justice, by telling the truth, by dealing with it honestly and with integrity, But this moves well beyond just court cases. It moves into your daily life, because you might end up in a situation at work where your district manager shows up and calls you into the office, and they ask if you've seen your boss do something shady. And now you got a decision to make. Do I rat out my boss, who I like, who is my friend, who's been good to me, who said, if you lie, I'll give you lunch for a month? This is the kind of stuff we're talking about in our daily life. You're not to operate as society does. You're to operate as God's people are to operate. And what God is telling us today is you have a responsibility to tell the truth, whether it's your friend, your enemy, a foreigner, a citizen, rich, poor, powerful, weak, all across the board. Your responsibility is to tell the truth, because telling the truth will preserve justice for the parties involved. And so as God's people, we're called to respect human life by valuing human life, by protecting human life, and by preserving justice for human life. How do we preserve justice for human life? Making full restitution for personal loss, ensuring fair treatment for all people, and telling the truth no matter who or what it involves. That's what God expects of us. And the reason God calls us to respect human life, to value it, to protect it, to preserve justice for it, is because as sinful people, we have the tendency not to respect human life. We have the tendency, because we are fundamentally broken, to fall short of God's law. And thus we have Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And so as much instruction as we have from God, we far too often fail to live up to God's law, and that's why we needed Jesus. Because Jesus respected all human life. Jews, Galileans, Samaritans, Romans, priests, tax collectors, fishermen, beggars, prostitutes, thieves. He loved all. He rebuked all. And he forgave all who repented. And that was regardless of their race, regardless of their occupation, regardless of their social standing. No, Jesus valued human life. He protected human life, and he preserved justice for human life. And he gave his own life on the cross to show mercy to human life. That when we were undeserving, he died for our shortcomings. That by faith in him, we could be forgiven, we could be saved, and we could have eternal life, regardless of what we've done, regardless of what we look at, what language we speak, what our family background is, what our shortcomings are. We can all be saved because Jesus so valued your life that he gave his own life for you. And so as his people now, he calls us to follow in his steps and do the same. No matter who it is, no matter what is involved, we ought to show respect to human life. And that's something that you can put into practice tonight as you go home, with your family, at work tomorrow, school tomorrow, wherever you go, for us to remember we got to respect human life in albeit a broken world by valuing and protecting human life and preserving justice. How do we do that? You do someone wrong, make it good. Make it right. You ensure that when you look at people in society, you are seeing them as valuable in God's eyes, and you treat them fairly, regardless of who they are or what they're involved in. And then to ensure that we are truth tellers. Regardless of whether it benefits us or hurts us, we concern ourselves with what is true. So let's show respect to human life. Our Father, we come to you today Grateful that you value us, that you protect us, that you preserve justice for us, but certainly thankful that you show mercy to us. That's not what we deserve, but it's what you've kindly offered. And so I just want to thank you for your grace to us. And I pray you would help us to make application in our lives personally about maybe some wrongs that need to be made right, about maybe some ways that we have acted prejudicially against others, or perhaps about ways that we have not been truth tellers. Help us, Father, to allow your word to shape us into Christ's image. It's in his name I pray. Amen.